Welcome to the Seeker to Seeker podcast. I'm your host Simeon, and I bring you conversations with students of the human spirit. Today's guest is Professor Edward Kelly. Professor Kelly is a research professor at the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. A Ph.D. in cognitive sciences, Professor Kelly's research explores mind-brain issues with a focus on psi phenomena that challenge the current neuroscientific view of the mind. Professor Kelly has published peer works in which he argues for a break from the physicalist view of the mind, drawing upon empirical evidence such as near-death experience, stigmata, and mystical experience. He has been main editor of the books Irreducible Mind, Beyond Physicalism, and Consciousness Unbound. In our conversation, I spoke with Professor Kelly about the insights he's gained from decades of being at the cutting edge of psi research. We discussed the nature of consciousness, the mind-matter duality, the various models of post-mortem survival, and the paradigm shift that is approaching the scientific community. We also spoke about the difficulties of sticking out too much in the scientific community, and how studying the human spirit has transformed Professor Kelly's personal life. If you like this sort of content, make sure to like and subscribe. Also, follow the link in the comments section to sign up to the Seeker to Seeker newsletter and never miss out on new content. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. So, you were talking about mystical experiences and extraordinary states of consciousness as windows to that other reality that we're not able to see and understand currently.
Yeah.
So I was curious because you and your team, you've already produced 3 massive volumes studying such experiences, and also other phenomena as well. But I was wondering, so far, what is your understanding of have you classified these experiences? Have you in any way organized them? And have you gotten a clearer picture of consciousness and the structure of consciousness and the different states that can be entered, perhaps how we can enter them, how they compare to one another? Have you gotten a clearer idea of this?
Yeah, let me just say for anybody who listens to this, to find out more about DOPS and our various programs, just Google on DOPS UVA. That's DOPS blank UVA, and you'll go right to the website. Tons of information there, including lots of papers and that sort of stuff. So we ourselves have done very little to advance that agenda so far, but I hope that our group will in the future. And as I said earlier, I think the two, at this point, the two really most critical avenues for advancing the subject in terms of scientific research are psychedelic research, because of its capacity to produce mystical experiences on demand. And it can certainly do that. They can certainly do that. And meditation. Now, meditation, you probably know, is a subject that's gotten a lot of traction in recent years, the last 20 years, let's say. Partly because researchers have been able to sort of attach the subject to public health. Meditation is clearly good for various things like, your heart's behavior, anxiety, maybe depression, things like that. But I have to say that even though there's been a lot of new research, the great bulk of it is of rather little interest from this point of view.
I think I know where you're going. Need to quote Ken Wilber, who says, I don't meditate to deal with stress. I meditate to speak with God. So perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Mike Murphy, is a co-founder of Esalen and a 70-year meditator. He jokes about meditation for hemorrhoids and stuff like that. Anyway, so they're mostly kind of poking around in the shallows of the subject, but I think it's inevitable as time goes by that they will work their way into the deeper parts where it connects with things like psi research and mystical experience. So those are the two big growth areas. And for anybody who's working toward a career in research, I would urge those people to look in those directions as a place to anchor yourself.
So can you tell me how you've personally managed to keep on going in this environment? Because, you know, your path and the path of your colleagues is very different to the path of somebody whose work is always being celebrated in a society where, you know, your work would be given a platform. It would certainly be celebrated, even if something in it is one day proven to be in some way or another erroneous. Still, the potential and the different avenues of new exploration you're bringing, it's amazing. But all of this happens inside an environment that seems to be very hostile to anything entering the popular understanding and popular knowledge. Yeah. So how have you managed to stay sane and to stay motivated?
Well, I had the great good fortune to have parents who consistently encouraged me in relation to career and work and so on, to find something that I thought was worthwhile and do that no matter what. They were never interested, and I've never been interested in sort of conventional career stuff like salaries and, you know, approbation or honors. And as I said, on my very first encounter with the subject and William James's involvement with it, I realized that, wow, you know, if this stuff is for real, it is really important. It really affects our fundamental ideas about the nature of things at a very basic level. And I've retained that intuition, faith, ever since. I find this work to be more interesting than anything else I could possibly do. And I keep plugging away at it as best I can. It's been a hard road at times. I mean, for example, about 1987, we had been at the electrical engineering department at Duke for 10 years or so. We got a new department chairman in electrical engineering and a new dean for the School of Engineering, both of whom were implacably hostile to the kind of work that we were doing. So we realized we were going to have to leave. Went off on our own for a while, quickly ran out of money. And at that point, I started applying for jobs. And by then I had 2 kids from a first marriage. So I wrote to a number of places that I wouldn't even have bothered applying to coming right out of graduate school. And I remember one in particular, I got a letter. I sent a letter to this department. I won't identify them. And within days, I got a direct response from the chairman of that department who said, Mr. Kelly, very pointedly, since I was a Ph.D., Mr. Kelly, there is no room in this department of scientific psychology for someone with your interests.
Wow.
Discussion. Wow. That was a shock to me, I must say. But like I say, I personally think that the collective work over 140 years now, the Society for Psychical Research in London was founded in 1882. William James thought the battle was over basically by the early 20th century. It goes on today. It's amazing to see how the same old arguments come up over and over again. But I personally believe that the totality of spontaneous case field studies and experimental studies has shown far beyond any reasonable possibility of doubt that psi phenomena exist as facts of nature, period. I think you can take that to the bank. And consequently, that our most fundamental ideas about the nature of reality have to be modified in a way that will preserve what's good in science as it has developed so far, but also allows us to make some kind of sense out of not only psi phenomena, but things like mystical experiences, extreme forms of creativity. A guy like the Indian mathematician Ramanujan, for example, is so off the charts in our present conceptual apparatus in cognitive psychology, so primitive, that there's absolutely no way of explaining a guy like that. I mean, he is just extraordinary. And I personally see all these things as being consistent with the Myers-James picture of the psyche, in which our everyday consciousness, which contemporary psychology and neuroscience take as, all the consciousness there is in association with us, and which is manufactured by our brains, has larger, more inclusive consciousness, possibly more than one. Myers argued for the existence of one that he called the subliminal self, which is much like Jung's self, a more comprehensive, in deeper contact with the whole of reality, which can explain things like psi phenomena and genius and mystical experiences. James, in his last decade, essentially carried Myers' conception in philosophical directions toward, but not quite to, an absolute idealism. Now, where will this all come out? We don't really quite know. As you know, in our middle book, Beyond Physicalism, we arrive collectively, not unanimously, but the central tendency, the main tendency of that book is toward a evolutionary panentheism. And just to say a little bit about what that means, it's a big subject and gaining a lot of traction, certainly in theological circles, not so much in psychology or philosophy, but it's a near neighbor of the kinds of idealism that are now being taken seriously by many philosophers. Yeah, let me just insert that. Harold Ottmansbacher and some friends of his attend a lot of philosophy of mind meetings, and they report that physicalism is tanking among young philosophers in particular, and that most people are now interested in what's going to replace the conventional physicalist viewpoint. So that's a very promising development. But panentheism kind of splits the difference between traditional theisms and pantheism. Theism is, for example, the theistic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all picture an highest being of some sort who's essentially outside creation, builds it or makes it and sort of stands back, may intervene from time to time, but they're basically separate things. Pantheism, often identified with Spinoza, God is identified with the whole of creation. Panentheism is sort of in between in the sense that, yes, there's a highest being who is infused within everything that exists, but there's also something left over, somewhat in the manner of how our minds are to our bodies. That is, somehow ontologically perhaps distinct from the manifest world, and yet infused thoroughly in it. That's the brief version. A terrific, by the way, it's one by Hartshorn and Rees. It's called Philosophers Speak of God. It's really an extraordinary book, and they talk about people like William James and Peirce and, well, a bunch of others, about 50 others from various traditions as exemplars of that basic point of view. And as I mentioned earlier, that seems to be where Jung was headed in his last days.
So, Ed, here we touch upon a question that I previously mentioned to you that I have, which is that your work, you and your colleagues' work, touches upon post-mortem survival. It also touches upon reincarnation, and it also touches upon some sort of unitary consciousness that underlies all of life. So I'm wondering, how can these things be true all at once, or perhaps some of them are true, or how would the MyersJames picture of personality and mind, how would it accommodate all of these phenomena at the same time?
Let me sketch my understanding of this situation. The essence of Myers's picture of human personality was to conceive of a larger, normally hidden consciousness that includes the everyday consciousness. He generated a lot of evidence for that picture, which William James took seriously. And in his, beginning with the varieties of religious experience, and let me just mention, by the way, that James says at multiple points in that book, which is the best-selling psychology book of all time, that he is using Myers's model to try to understand various phenomena of religious experience. And in the end of the book, he sort of kind of hints at a bigger program that he is working on to elaborate that basic picture in new directions. And in a pluralistic universe, he does exactly that. He takes Myers's idea of the subliminal self as given and imagines it being extended. That is, if it's true, and he thinks it is true for good evidential reasons, that our everyday consciousness, it lives within a larger consciousness of some sort, which is more inclusive, has capacities of its own, such as psi capacities, for example, access to bigger parts of the world. It could be true that that larger consciousness is itself a portion of some still larger consciousness. There might be multiple levels extending up to some highest form. And it's there that he wants to draw a contrast between his view and the prevailing kinds of philosophical absolute idealism, because he doesn't like the idea of one all-inclusive consciousness that's responsible for everything. He doesn't want God to have to account for the presence of evil in the world, for example. He'd like whatever corresponds to our ideas of God to be more sort of accessible to us as humans.
Ed, just a clarifying question here. So James's idea of different levels of consciousness being hierarchically ordered, does it go down as well, so that there are different layers of consciousness nested within our own selves? So let's say some unconscious behavior that we exhibit is like a smaller consciousness nested within our larger personality, in the same way that our personality is a part of something greater.
He doesn't specifically go in that way, but I think would have been sympathetic to it. And we talk about it a bit in the next to last chapter of Beyond Physicalism. That's also, of course, fundamental to what is one of the most important and most neglected philosophical developments of the 20th century. I'm talking about the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. We talk about it a little bit in Irreducible Mind as sort of exemplifying one end of a range of possibilities. You know, the game at that point is, okay, we've got all these rogue phenomena. Might we expand our philosophical horizons in a way that would allow us to understand how the world is constructed such that these things can happen? And so we sketched out a range between some kind of updated form of dualism, which retains a traditional concept of matter, and we took Whitehead as an example, mainly because we had an active Whitehead kind of subgroup within our Esalen operation. Mike Murphy has always been very keen on Whitehead and also on Aurobindo, and we had a guy in our group who was in touch with both threads of that and tried to put them together. So, but you know, for Whitehead, I mean, people joke about Whitehead as characterizing physics as the study of very small organisms. So there's some proto-consciousness associated right down to the very bottom level of whatever the littlest bits are. And that's still very controversial, but certainly there's been a lot of recent work that shows that consciousness probably does go far deeper into reality than most scientists traditionally thought. I mean, Descartes, for example, thought we had all the consciousness there is, even animals don't have that. John Searle joked about how anybody who thinks his dogs aren't conscious hasn't met his dog, Ludwig. Typical Searle joke. Yeah, and Searle actually tells a story about how he was lecturing in Portugal or somewhere, talking about this problem. Where does consciousness first arise in evolution? He said, well, dogs and cats, we all know they're conscious. And goes several steps further. But, you know, when you get to things like slugs, it's hard for me to take that seriously. And a woman spoke up at that moment who was apparently one of the world's leading experts on slugs and declared her belief that slugs are conscious. But that's a very hard line to draw. And you see there's a fundamental contrast here between bottom-up theories, which say that we start with this, you know, ultimate physical stuff, whatever it is, and at some point it becomes complicated enough in some way we don't understand to generate a little bit of consciousness. And then evolution proceeds, organisms become progressively more complex, and their mental capacities and consciousness, they become correspondingly more complex. And I think that's clearly true.
So to ask another clarifying question here, when you mention consciousness, when you speak about consciousness, you don't mean merely awareness, you mean also a mental life, correct?
Well, it's very hard to talk sensibly about what it might be like as you go further and further down. I mean, yes, I tend to think of consciousness as being the fundamental thing which can express itself through organisms depending on their complexity. And again, I'm talking in this very dualistic way that keeps the traditional matter side intact. And that's easy for me to do. It's a way of thought that I grew up with and still lapse into. But there's another way of thinking about this, which is that, yes, physical structures are evolving, and there's something about them that allows this independent consciousness that's at the base of everything to express itself more fully in connection with these more complicated organisms. Now, we don't understand what that connection is. We have some little bits of ideas about it. And let me here inject one extremely important modern line of research: near-death experiences. They're interesting in general. I mean, near-death experiences, from my point of view, can be thought of as mystical experiences which occur under less than optimal conditions. I mean, this leaves aside even ones like mountaineers who, fall off a cliff, but luckily for them, end up in a big snowbank somewhere that, their brains have been intact all the way down and they live. But I'm thinking particularly of, there are two categories of near-death experiences that are of special importance, I think. And those are ones that occur under extreme physiological conditions like deep general anesthesia and or especially cardiac arrest. Because under those conditions, the physiological conditions that virtually all neuroscientists believe are necessary for conscious experience of any sort have been not only degraded, but essentially abolished. And yet people are reporting what amount to mystical experiences under those circumstances. And they can be connected to the time of apparent unconsciousness by the fact that they describe things that happened during that period, sometimes things that happened remotely. So they're occurring, those experiences, in connection with a brain that shouldn't be able to support consciousness. That, I think, is an important piece of evidence pointing to the reality of this independent consciousness that can normally express itself in more restricted ways in connection with the functioning of our brains.
Okay, so in the MyersJames model of consciousness, how would this model explain, or how does it propose an explanation for a person being able to see and hear with their physical heart having stopped, their eyes being shut, their ears being, I know that they put some sort of signal in their ears when they're on the operating room or whatever. So how would this sort of conscious experience be possible without the body?
Well, how best to say this?
Okay, this is a short commercial break. Just wanted to thank you for watching this video and to invite you to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Beside this podcast, Seeker to Seeker is also offering video essays on psychology, philosophy and religion, and in-depth articles on our website. All are free and I make all of them, so I'd really appreciate your support in whatever form you show it. And last thing, I promise, for the most appreciative members of our audience, there is a Seeker to Seeker Patreon page. And there you can show your love with a small monthly donation. And that would be amazing because I've never actually made any money for any of this. Okay, so that's it. Self-marketing really makes me feel funny every time I do it. So now back to the conversation.
Consider your dreams. In your dreams, you manufacture a world that in many respects is like this world that you and I are inhabiting. I'm looking at your books on your bookshelf. You know they're there. And yet, there is essentially zero corresponding sensory input coming into you. And yet, consciousness is somehow able to manufacture that world for you during your sleep. I think mystical experiences are of a similar type. And actually, various people have tried to sketch out how such a disembodied consciousness might be able to use psi processes to acquire information about what's going on in this world, and even to have some kinds of effects in it. Now, let me just say that the same picture of some kind of more inclusive, higher consciousness that may be accessible, for example, through psychedelics, or deep meditation, or deep hypnosis, or in other ways we don't even know about. I mean, well, let me digress a moment here. You know, how many thousand cultures there are recognized worldwide, but at least 90% of them contain some sort of explicit mechanism for induction of altered states, mystical type states, which are cultivated often using horrendous mechanisms, specifically because of their social value. You know, it's expected that people who can get into these states can do things like heal or locate lost property or find out who the bad guy is who's, pointing the bone at one of your friends or something like that. And really the extremity of the procedures that are used as a measure of that social value that the altered states are held in. So let's say we all have these kind of capacities, but they're normally hidden from us just because we don't get into the right kind of physiological state to allow them to express themselves. But what I'm trying to say here is that this realm of research, which is certainly going to advance over the next decades rapidly, I think, meditation research and psychedelic research in particular, will be instructing us about the conditions that allow these higher capacities to express themselves in our everyday waking lives. And they could be of enormous personal and social value if we handle that properly. However, I mean, we see how everything else gets commodified and commercialized and exploited for greedy personal gains. There's no guarantee that any of this will be done in an ethically rigorous way. So I think we should all be, on the one hand, very optimistic and hopeful about the possibilities for this kind of work, and at the same time, better pay attention to how it develops, because there are lots of potential for ugliness. The big ultimate question is, let's say there is this ultimate consciousness. How does the one engender the many and the world that the many inhabit. Myers and James, well, a guy like Bernardo Castro thinks there are really just two levels to this system. There is the ultimate consciousness, which produces everything, and us with our limited everyday consciousness. And so he's very much of the opinion, which he likes for aesthetic reasons, that when we die, the dewdrop into the shining sea, the limited consciousness loses its individual identity and merges with the ultimate. But from the Myers-James point of view, there could be at least one level in between. That ordinary personal identity is not really resonant in the brain in the way that most neuroscientists think it is, and can continue after bodily death. And that would account for the possibility of reincarnation, for example. That's something about that former living person, some essence or distillation of that previous life can re-embody itself in another time and place. So all those things go together. I had a fight with Bernardo when he produced his chapter for Consciousness Unbound, because I said, and I believe this is true, that in very strongly expressing his preferred personal understanding, which is the dewdrop into the shining sea, he's ignoring all the evidence for personal survival. That is, that in the best cases, it appears that a personality with all of its typical cognitive characteristics, its specific memories, dialect, humor, personal qualities, have survived because they reappear in the behavior of a medium. I mean, one of the best cases of this type, which anybody interested in the subject should look into, is that of the so-called GP phase of Mrs. Piper's mediumship. GP was a guy who died under somewhat mysterious circumstances as a young man, and soon appeared in Mrs. Piper's seances. One of the main features of that period was that among the hundreds of sitters that her investigator, Richard Hodgson, brought to her after she had gone into trance, there were 30 that had been acquaintances of the previously living GP. And according to Hodgson's report, the GP persona, this whatever was communicating through Mrs. Piper, recognized all and only those 30 persons. And for a number of them delivered large amounts of very realistic kind of, the verisimilitude of her impersonation of GP was compelling to many of those people, just because of their history of shared experience. So that's the kind of stuff that exemplifies the mediumistic literature at its best. And of course, there are all the reincarnation cases. Ian Stevenson, who was the founder of DOPS, really initiated that line of work. And he and his colleagues have ultimately documented on the order of 2,500 cases of that sort from all over the world, many in great detail, some of which are extremely compelling. And I think it has to be said that this is now one of the most important dimensions of evidence for personal survival. That is, at least partial survival of an individual's mind and personality and consciousness as you would have experienced it during that person's life.
Yeah. Here, I want to ask you, because the way you're discussing this life and whatever is beyond it, it seems like, yes, there's this realm of unitary consciousness, and then it has some effects on the physical world. But I've been very interested by an idea by the Greek author Nikos Kazantzakis, who writes about it in his little book called Saviors of God, I think, in English.
I've not heard of it.
There he writes of God, and he was actually suppressed by the church, the Orthodox Church in Greece, because of his views. But he talks about God in a way that God is not simply something or somebody ruling over humanity and shaping the physical world, but he is also being shaped by the physical world and depends on the life and the choices and the struggles of each and every conscious being. And so in this way, I was thinking whether your findings allow for any sort of dialogue between mind and matter, so that not only matter evolves to accommodate more and more mind, but mind also in some way grows and flourishes because of what happens in this material realm.
Well, yeah, this is not a matter of evidence or proof or anything like that, but it's very much part of the evolutionary panentheism point of view. It's really explicit in Whitehead, for example. And James, God bless him, I mean, William James was a philosopher of the old type who was totally focused on philosophy as an instrument of real human life, you know, as opposed to the whole analytic tradition, which I personally think, and James would have agreed, has largely gotten lost in, you know, little technical, logical stuff and gotten away from classical, traditional philosophy, trying to forge a conception of the world that will be helpful to human beings. For James, I mean, he announces it in varieties of religious experience that he likes the idea that we in our own poor ways may be helping this ultimate being, whatever it is, to do his or her work, its work. And that's very explicit in Whitehead's scheme of things. Whitehead saw the task of modern philosophy to be reconciliation of science and religion, or science and spirituality, let's say, as the two greatest forces in human history. And of course, he was an immense figure in math and science and logic of the early 20th century. He developed his own relativity theory, he's co-author of Principia Mathematica and all that. This is a giant. I mean, a guy who's off the charts. His system is very difficult, but it gives a picture of an organic universe evolving with God and that universe co-creating what is. So we really can, if we respond to the lures provided by that ultimate being, which have to do with things, he was very Platonic, like many mathematicians, you know, truth, beauty, goodness, those are the things that lure us. And if we respond to those lures and run our individual lives well, we can help the universe evolve in a healthy way. But it's not guaranteed. There's no foreordained plan that's working itself out. And evil is real in the world, and we're responsible for most, if not all of it. So it's a battle. If anything, I kind of tend towards Zoroastrianism, you know, the battle of Ormuzd and Ahriman for the ultimate destiny of the universe.
Has your work discovered or compiled any sort of evidence for evil here in this world in some way being rooted or issuing from a source out there in the more or the subliminal self, or whatever we choose to call it?
That's a good question. We have not really dealt with that very much, nor did Myers. You know, Myers allowed for that possibility, certainly. He described the subliminal region of the psyche as containing probably bad stuff as well as good stuff, but he did not himself spend much time on that. That's a place where Jung, I think, certainly has done a better job, partly because of his life as a clinician. He encountered, and of course he lived during the, you know, rise of Nazism and all that. And he was very preoccupied with the problem of evil, partly because his father was I think a Lutheran minister of some sort, and had a very traditional theistic kind of conception of things. And well, Jung struggles with that problem. You know, his answer to Job. Have you ever looked at that? You know, that's a difficult book, but you know, he clearly is prepared to accept the idea that God himself has some evil parts about him, let alone us. Yeah, let me I'll tell you a story. This
Yeah.
anecdote. Don't take it too seriously, but it made a big impression on me. Back in 1973, I was working at the Rhine Lab, and one of my college professors, a guy named Irvin Child, was on a sabbatical at the Rhine Institute, and he knew a number of people, but one of them was a guy named John Nicola, Father John Nicola. He was a Jesuit, and it turned out he was one of the main exorcists in the Catholic Church. There are a number of these guys. He was an East Coast guy who, well, we talked about this over lunch, and he said that in the course of his career, he was probably 60-ish, I think, at the time, he had been brought in on maybe 1,000 cases altogether. And of those, he said 90% were pure psychopathology, nothing of any particular interest. The rest, he said, often included what he thought were genuine paranormal elements, or things happened that seemed to involve psi-like processes. And this is the scary part, he said there was maybe a half a dozen cases that he had seen in which he felt compelled to take seriously the possibility of diabolical possession. And that was due to the fact that those cases exhibited these features. Oh yeah, this guy had been a consultant to the movie, The Exorcist. So it was that kind of stuff. This little kid starts declaring in Latin that it's the devil. I mean, makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck. You can imagine what actually being in that situation would be like.
Yeah.
And there was one other one that impressed me quite a bit. One of our colleagues, was Adam Crabtree, who he spent most of his life working with cases of multiple personality. Big fan of Myers and so on. He has a great chapter on dissociation and psychological automatisms, secondary personality in Irreducible Mind. Anyway, he had been called in on one case in particular in which he had to take seriously the possibility of some kind of diabolical possession, just because of the extreme character of the things that happened. So, I don't know. I have no personal position on that, but I've heard some things that worried me a whole lot. There could certainly be things out there that we don't really know about that are just profoundly evil and trying to wreak havoc in human life.
Yeah.
Gotta stay away from them.
So in the last couple of minutes, perhaps a final question, because I don't want to take too much of your time. I am just discovering your work, but you've been inside of this area of study for decades now. So how has the accumulative effect of years of dealing with this sort of material, studying it and writing about it and thinking about it, how has this left a mark on your personal life and your personal way of going through life and your thinking about life?
Well, yeah, for sure. My basic ideas about things have dramatically changed since graduate school. I just was, like most people, I think, kind of being run through the sort of meat grinder that our social arrangements are. That is, people are just kind of seized upon by their surroundings and kind of, directed toward various slots in the variety of jobs that are available within, the society you happen to inhabit. I never took religion at all seriously as a child. I was brought up Catholic, went to church with my parents, but for me it was mainly an annoyance. I developed a way of escaping when I was a kid. I was about 10 or 12. I used to hold my breath until I would become faint, and then tell my parents I felt I was going to pass out and needed to go outside for air, and they let me do that on a pretty regular basis. And of course, the moment I got to college, I abandoned any explicit identification with Catholicism. But I guess, I knew that my father, even though I didn't think he took the specifics of Catholicism very clearly, I always had the sense that he felt there was something to the basic idea of there being something out there that kind of underlies everything that we normally experience. And I guess that's been part of my constitution all along. And essentially what's happened is that over these decades, I've grown toward a picture that I think is both consistent with leading edge science, in fact, more so than the prevailing physicalism, and also leaves room for human religious and spiritual experiences. As I said earlier, I'm envious of you for having had one or more big experiences with psychedelics. And, I'm still thinking about how to do that myself. I have friends who have access to mushrooms and that sort of thing. And there are, of course, studies going on now here and there, for example, at Johns Hopkins up in Baltimore, not too far away. So I keep checking their website to see if there's something I could plug into and, do it under well-controlled circumstances. But I take all that stuff very seriously. I think it's very important for humanity at large, as well as for us individually. Ideas do have consequences. And I think a lot of our social problems, the problems of our civilization, are deeply connected with the kind of physicalist worldview that grew up in connection with science over the preceding several centuries, which has now reached its own limits. And I think the situation screams for something new to replace that, something that will accommodate what it accomplished that was good, but make it grow in ways that will accommodate these other kinds of experiences. And I think that could potentially help us come to grips with our current crises of civilization. That's, we can't be naively optimistic about it, but it's about the only hope I see, to tell you the truth. I think if we continue on our present course, we're just going to annihilate ourselves, either through climate change or nuclear war or something of that sort. And yet, I have to say that I feel more optimistic right now than I ever have in my career, that we are at or very near a tipping point. And these things can happen fast. There are sort of rules of thumb, like if something like 5% of scientists became convinced that something like what we're proposing is closer to the truth than what's traditionally been marketed as the scientific worldview, things could flip very fast.
Yeah, that would be a total shift in the way we think about life and also live life, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you for watching to the very end. If you enjoyed this conversation, I would really highly, very much recommend you to check out my podcast with Chris Beisch. All these realms of experience Ed has been referring to here were actually experienced by Chris through decades worth of high-dose LSD work. When two such vastly different methods of study reveal the same story, we really ought to reconsider how solid our understanding of life really is. Thank you again, and remember Rumi's words. What you seek is seeking you. See you next time.